What if I told you that one of the greatest sudden drops in crime in Welsh history wasn't actually caused by a new wave of legislation
Right.
or, a massive increase in police presence or even an economic boom?
Which is usually what we'd assume, right?
Exactly. But according to historical accounts, it was actually sparked by a 26-year-old coal miner he wouldn't stop praying.
It's wild to think about.
We're talking about a societal shift so profound that bars completely emptied out. Magistrates literally abandoned their courthouses because there were no cases to try.
Yeah, it's a stunning historical anomaly, honestly,
Yeah.
because we are so conditioned to look for tangible levers when society changes.
Oh, for sure. We want the data points.
Right, we want to point to the generals or the politicians, the inventors.
Right.
But the text we're looking at today argues that the most massive, earth-shaking events in human history are, well, they're actually forged entirely in secret.
In a way, most of the modern world just completely dismisses. Well, today we are doing a deep dive into an extensive and honestly fascinating document from Avishwa Ministries. It's titled Radical Prayer.
And it is radical in every sense of the word.
Yeah, and our mission today for you, the listener, is to uncover the core themes of this text. We're taking the concept of prayer, which, let's be honest, a lot of people view as a repetitive religious ritual.
Or just a polite tradition before dinner.
Right, or a quick 9/11 cry for help when things go sideways. But we are exploring the author's claim that it's actually a direct, dynamic relationship with God that has the literal power to spark global revivals.
And what stands out immediately in this document is the framing. The author doesn't present prayer as like a passive coping mechanism to just help you feel better about a bad situation.
Definitely not.
It's framed as this active, potent, and sometimes really disruptive force, one that fundamentally alters both the individual and, like you said with Wales, the physical world around them.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even touch on how prayer supposedly changes the world, the text insists we have to establish exactly what prayer is.
Down to the mechanical level.
Yeah, and they use a very practical, modern analogy to explain it. The telephone line.
Which is such an effective metaphor for visualizing something completely invisible. The document defines prayer as a direct telephone line to God the Father.
But it's not just some generic, connection to the universe.
No, not at all. The author outlines a very specific spiritual circuitry here. The connection itself is established through Jesus, and the Holy Spirit acts as the signal or the transmission carrying the message.
Which implies that prayer isn't just bouncing random, hopeful words off the ceiling.
Right.
Just crossing your fingers and hoping the cosmos hears you.
Precisely. The text argues it is highly specific directed communication, and more importantly, it requires a functioning relationship to actually keep the line open.
That brings up the marriage analogy in the text, which I thought was just a really illuminating way to look at it.
Oh yeah, that part is very striking.
The author asks us to imagine a marriage where the spouses only speak to each other maybe, 3 times a year?
If that.
And when they do speak, they just recite rehearsed mechanical poems to one another. Like they never share their actual fears, their messy hopes, their daily frustrations.
I mean, any marriage counselor will tell you that relationship is doomed.
Yeah, it would wither into nothing.
Because it's a performance, not a partnership.
Right. And the author points out that in Christian theology, the body of Christ is considered the bride. So the text argues that treating God like this distant, detached spouse...
Just reading off a script when someone gets sick.
Exactly. It completely stunts any actual spiritual intimacy.
What's fascinating here is the text's assertion that God doesn't merely want reverence from a distance, he actively craves intimacy.
Wow.
The author points out that when Jesus taught his disciples how to pray, he didn't hand them a sterile list of philosophical rules.
Or
like a magical incantation.
the Lord's Prayer, right.
Right. The very first word he instructed them to use was Father.
Which changes everything.
It completely shifts the paradigm. It implies that effective prayer flows entirely from a place of familial relationship, not just a place of urgent necessity.
I totally get the relational aspect, but I have to push back here, just on behalf of anyone listening who might be naturally skeptical or highly logical.
Sure, go for it.
The text actually acknowledges a very common practical objection to this whole concept. Like, if God is supposedly omniscient, meaning he already knows our every thought, our hidden fears, every need before we even articulate it, why on earth do we need to speak it out loud?
It's the classic question.
Doesn't that make the whole exercise of praying totally redundant?
It is a totally logical question. Why brief an all-knowing being, right? But the text's response digs deeply into the psychology of relationship.
Boy.
The author argues that God doesn't want puppets. He wants children. Think of it this way. If you're a parent, you might already know your child had a terrible day at school just by the way they slammed the front door.
Or just the look on their face.
Exactly. You have all the information. You don't need the data. But you still desperately want them to come to you, sit down, and open up willingly.
Because the goal isn't the information transfer, it's the connection.
Spot on. The speaking out loud, the pouring out of actual messy emotions, it's an act of vulnerability.
Yeah.
The text suggests that when you pray, you aren't giving God new data to process. You are giving him you. It's an act of surrender that actually bridges the gap between creator and creation.
So you're actively participating in the relationship. And according to the document, once that relationship is established, there is a massive shift in how believers are meant to approach God.
A structural shift, really.
Right. The author spends a lot of time contrasting the Old Covenant with the New Covenant to explain this. Under the Old Testament system, prayer and authority were strictly tied to a physical location.
The altar.
The altar. And constant repetitive sacrifices.
We really have to clarify what that looked like historically, just to understand the contrast.
Yeah, walk us through that.
So in the ancient Jewish temple, there was a literal, heavy, woven veil separating the main areas from a room called the Holy of Holies.
And that room was a big deal.
A huge deal. It represented the localized, concentrated presence of God on earth. And no one could just stroll in.
Right, it was highly restricted.
Only the high priest, once a year, with the right sacrifices, could enter. It was a system fundamentally built on restricted access and, honestly, fear of getting it wrong.
But the text emphasizes that under the New Covenant, at the moment of the crucifixion, that massive veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom.
Literally ripped open.
Yeah. And here is the crucial distinction the author makes. That veil didn't tear because humanity suddenly reached a critical mass of praying harder or being better people.
No, not at all.
It tore because the sacrifice of Jesus was entirely sufficient, period. Therefore, the text argues, New Covenant believers do not pray for access to God, they pray from access.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is a monumental psychological shift for a believer. Under the old system, prayer was characterized by this deep underlying anxiety. Am I clean enough today? Have I offered enough to even be heard?
Oh, I see.
But praying from access, as the text defines it, means you already have a permanent seat at the table. You're operating from a place of legal adoption and spiritual authority.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the listener as they are, driving to work or folding laundry right now? How does praying from access change a random Tuesday?
It means shifting the entire posture of your prayer life from desperation to partnership.
Partnership.
Yeah. The text argues that you aren't a beggar trying to twist God's arm or shout loud enough to get his attention. You already possess his attention.
Right.
However, this is where the text introduces a pretty sobering caveat. The author directly addresses the painful, universal reality of unanswered prayer.
Which everyone struggles with.
Exactly. And interestingly, they suggest that when the line seems dead, it usually isn't about God ignoring the call.
Right. The text claims it often points back to the individual, specifically to a misaligned heart, or what they call hidden idols. They use this phrase, the altar of the heart.
Let's unpack that because it's central to their argument. The author suggests that before God ever looks at your hands or your community service or your outward religious actions,
Stuff everyone else sees.
exactly. Before all that, he looks at what is burning on your internal altar. What do you actually worship?
And an idol in this modern context isn't like a golden calf in the living room.
No.
It's an obsession with a promotion, or a deep-seated bitterness you refuse to let go of, or an addiction to the approval of others.
Exactly. The text argues that God does not share space with a divided heart. If there's pride or materialism sitting on the altar of your heart, it creates spiritual static on that telephone line we talked about.
Wow, spiritual static. That's a great way to put it.
Because true authority in prayer, according to this document, flows entirely from a heart that is aligned with God's will. The goal isn't to command God to execute your personal wish list.
Right, like a vending machine.
Yeah. The goal is to align your desires with His so perfectly that when you ask for something, it's already what He intended to do.
And if a believer actually achieves that, if they truly possess this incredible, direct, static-free access to the creator of the universe, the text argues that the only logical, natural response is intense physical and emotional dedication.
Which brings us to a huge theme.
Right. A word the author uses repeatedly to describe this is fervency.
Fervency.
Yes.
The text defines radical fervency not as a feeling, but as a passionate, persistent, and active faith. It is the absolute opposite of passive, casual, or convenient religion.
And the historical examples they provide to illustrate this are honestly mind-blowing. They talk about John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and a 19th century pastor named Edward Payson.
Oh, the floorboard story.
Yes. According to the historical accounts cited in the text, these men prayed so intensely and so frequently that when they died, people found literal physical indents worn into the heavy wooden floorboards beside their beds.
Just from where their knees had been.
Yep.
The text also mentions Leonard Ravenhill, a renowned 20th century British preacher who reportedly spent 8 hours a day in prayer.
Okay, I have to stop you there. 8 hours.
Yeah, 8 hours.
Honestly, my first reaction to reading that wasn't overwhelming inspiration. It was absolute exhaustion.
Totally understandable.
I mean, how does the text differentiate between this kind of radical fervency and just a fast track to severe spiritual burnout? Because if I tell our listeners they need to pray 8 hours a day, they're going to turn this off right now.
This raises an important question, and it is exactly where the text pushes back hardest against the modern reader's sensibilities. The author is deeply critical of what they call microwave Christianity.
Microwave Christianity, I love that term.
It perfectly describes the desire for maximum spiritual results with minimum time and effort. But regarding the burnout question, the text argues that true fervent prayer doesn't drain you. It actually sustains you.
Assuming you're doing it right.
Right, provided you aren't doing it out of legalistic obligation.
It goes back to the intimacy piece. If you are just reciting a script for 8 hours, you'll burn out by day 2.
Exactly. But how does this apply to a normal person? The text quotes George Miller, a famous 19th century evangelist who cared for thousands of orphans in England. And he did it without ever asking for money.
Which is incredible on its own.
It is. His secret to success, as he described it, was surprisingly simple. Work and pray. Pray and work. The author isn't demanding you quit your job to stare at a wall. They are challenging the modern habit of setting up our chaotic schedules work. The gym, binge-watching shows, doom scrolling.
All the stuff we fill our days with.
Right, and then trying to pencil God into whatever tiny exhausted margins are left over at midnight.
Like a tired 3-minute prayer before you fall asleep.
Precisely. The text challenges us to pencil God in first, to prioritize that communion, and let that relationship dictate the rest of the schedule. You don't abandon your mortgage or your kids. You infuse those responsibilities with a continuous internal dialogue.
And the author shares another incredible account about Charles Finney, a major leader in the Second Great Awakening, to show what this intense, focused prayer actually looks like in practice.
The story about his acquaintance.
Yeah, the text recounts a story where an acquaintance of Finney's fell deathly ill. And Finney didn't just offer a polite thoughts and prayers platitude. According to his own accounts, Finney wrestled in prayer.
Like physically wrestled.
Yeah. He described struggling physically and spiritually until he experienced what he called a breakthrough. He said he was enabled to roll the burden of this woman's life onto God.
And the text points to this event as proof of their premise. Because according to the historical record, Finney immediately knew the prayer was answered, and shortly after, the woman completely recovered.
It's wild.
The author uses this to highlight prayer as a genuine spiritual labor.
And this labor, this fervency cultivated in secret, is the bridge to the next major theme of the document. Because the text argues that when individuals cultivate this kind of radical prayer behind closed doors, it inevitably overflows into the public sphere.
It can't be contained.
Right. And this, they claim, is the unseen spark behind every major global revival.
The author insists that cultural and spiritual revivals do not just fall from the sky arbitrarily.
They aren't just accidents.
No. They aren't engineered by clever church marketing campaigns or propelled by charismatic celebrity pastors either. Every single true revival, according to the text, is forged in what the author calls the womb of intercession.
Let's clarify that term, womb of intercession, because it sounds a bit intensely theological.
It does, yeah.
The author is essentially saying that prayer is the incubator. It's the hidden, quiet place where a massive movement is conceived and nourished long before anyone ever sees it born into the public eye.
That's a perfect translation. It starts with people praying, completely in obscurity, often for years.
Yeah.
And the historical progression the text uses to illustrate this is fascinating.
It really is. And you can see the stakes escalate with each example. We mentioned the 1904 Welsh revival at the top of the show.
Right.
The text notes, it didn't start in a massive stadium. It was sparked in a small youth meeting when a teenage girl named Florrie Evans simply stood up and publicly confessed her love for Jesus.
What the engine behind it
Was Evan Roberts, that coal miner who prayed relentlessly for one specific thing. He called it bending.
Bending, meaning a total, uncompromising surrender of the human will to the Holy Spirit.
Right. And according to the text, the result of that unseen surrender was a society so radically transformed that the local infrastructure of crime and vice literally collapsed from lack of participation.
Just incredible.
But then the text moves forward to the 1906 Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles, and the stakes get even higher regarding societal transformation.
Oh, Azusa Street is huge. It's widely considered the birth of the modern global Pentecostal movement. And the leader was an African-American preacher named William J. Seymour.
Who was not your typical megachurch leader?
Not at all. He was blind in one eye, he didn't have a massive platform, and he certainly wasn't a polished orator. In fact, the text notes that during the meetings, Seymour would often sit with his head literally inside 2 empty shoeboxes.
Okay, wait, we have to pause there. Praying with your head in shoeboxes sounds bizarre to a modern listener.
It sounds totally unhinged today.
Why on earth did he do that, and how does the text connect that weird detail to the outcome of the revival?
It sounds absurd until you understand the spiritual physics the author is proposing here. The text argues that Seymour put his head in those shoeboxes to physically block out every single distraction, including the audience.
Oh, I see.
He was completely removing his own human ego, his need to perform, from the equation. He was disappearing so that the Holy Spirit could take over.
And the result of that absolute ego death, according to the source, was a revival characterized by profound racial unity. I mean, in 1906, America, having Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian believers worshiping together as equals, was deeply illegal in many places.
And dangerous everywhere else.
Exactly.
The text implies that logical arguments couldn't dismantle the deeply entrenched racism of the era. But the intense, Spirit-led prayer born in those shoeboxes overrode the societal programming.
Wow.
And within 2 years, that racially unified, obscure movement in a dilapidated building sent missionaries to 50 different nations.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if you think Azusa Street had humble origins, the text points to the 1949 Hebrides revival on a remote island off the coast of Scotland.
Ah, the Smith sisters.
Yes, who sparked the societal transformation there. Not a theologian, not a visiting evangelist. It was sparked by 2 elderly sisters, Peggy and Christine Smith. They were 84 and 82 years old.
And the physical constraints they had were severe.
Right. The text notes Peggy was completely blind, and Christine was so severely bent over with arthritis, they couldn't even leave their tiny rural cottage.
But they had the telephone line.
Yeah.
And they had fervency.
Exactly. The text recounts how they prayed in their cottage 2 to 3 nights a week, interceding for their community, until a massive spiritual awakening swept the entire island, drawing thousands.
The author is using these specific accounts to hammer home a foundational thesis. The power of prayer has absolutely nothing to do with the physical capability, the status, or the visibility of the person praying.
It's completely independent of all that.
Entirely. The power resides entirely in the God they are praying to. The only human requirement is the fervency and the willingness to surrender.
Which brings us directly to the author's ultimate call to action for you, the listener, living in the modern day. Having laid out the mechanics of prayer and the historical proof of what intercession can accomplish, the text challenges modern believers to step up and become what it calls end-time watchmen.
This is a heavy prophetic concept in the text.
Break it down for us.
So the term watchman comes heavily from the Old Testament book of Ezekiel, specifically chapter 22. To understand it, you have to picture an ancient walled city. The stone walls were the city's only defense against invading armies or wild animals.
So if the wall crumbled or was breached,
The entire population was vulnerable to slaughter.
it was a literal life or death situation.
Utterly. And a watchman's job was to stand physically in the gap of that broken wall. They had to stay awake, sound the alarm when danger approached, and literally hold a line with their own bodies until a breach could be repaired.
The text maps this ancient military concept directly onto the modern spiritual landscape. The author warns that there is a spiritual enemy constantly seeking legal entry into our lives through what they call our gates.
Which they define as our minds, our homes, our schools, and our nations.
And the church, the everyday believer, is called to be the watchman standing in that spiritual breach.
The author issues a very urgent, passionate call for the restoration of continuous 24-hour prayer and worship cycles to guard these gates.
Which sounds logistically impossible for a modern church.
It does. But to prove this isn't just a modern impossibility, the text references the Moravian movement, the Herrnhut revival under Count Zinzendorf in the early 1700s.
This was a community of religious refugees living on a wealthy nobleman's estate, and they decided to start a rotating, continuous prayer vigil.
Right. They broke it into shifts, pledging that at least 2 people would be actively praying every hour of the day and night.
And according to the text, how long did they sustain that continuous prayer meeting?
Over 100 years. Unbroken.
A century of nonstop prayer. It's almost incomprehensible today. But the text makes a crucial point about the fruit of that labor. That single, tiny refugee community, through sustained intercession, birthed the first major wave of the modern Protestant global missionary movement.
They altered the religious landscape of the world from one tiny village.
Which perfectly aligns with the author's prophetic vision for today. The text envisions modern house churches, small groups, and individual families acting as what they call spiritual dynamos or lighthouses.
I love that imagery.
Yeah. Small, seemingly insignificant pockets of believers where continuous prayer is happening, actively pushing back the darkness in their specific neighborhoods.
The author actually ties this to a verse from the book of Habakkuk, stating the ultimate goal is that God's glory covers the earth as the waters cover the sea.
So if we synthesize the author's entire argument here, the text is issuing a stark warning against spiritual apathy. Apathy, comfort, and the distraction of the modern world are presented as the greatest enemies of the believer.
Absolutely. The role of the watchman is to actively, aggressively push back against cultural norms that exalt the self and ignore the divine.
Precisely. You are called to actively guard the spiritual gates of your community. The text makes it clear. You cannot just sit passively, watch the evening news, complain about how dark the world is getting, and consider yourself a faithful believer.
No, you have to get in the gap. You have to pick up the telephone.
Get in the gap through fervent prayer. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today unpacking radical prayer. We started by looking at prayer not as a lifeless religious checklist, but as a direct, dynamic telephone line to God that requires the vulnerability of a healthy marriage.
We explored the monumental psychological shift from the Old Covenant, where humanity begged and sacrificed for limited access, to the New Covenant, where the veil is torn and believers are invited to pray with authority right at the table.
We unpacked the intense physical and emotional dedication required for radical fervency, the kind of prayer that leaves actual indents in heavy wooden floorboards and prioritizes God before the schedule even begins.
And we traced how that hidden, secret place intercession is the unseen engine behind massive historical shifts, from Evan Roberts in Wales to William J. Seymour's shoeboxes at Azusa Street to the Blind Sisters in the Hebrides.
All of which leads to the author's urgent call for modern believers to wake up, reject apathy, and take up their post as watchmen, standing in the gap for their homes and their nations.
The text beautifully summarizes the thesis of this entire journey with one single powerful statement. Prayer is not where faith ends. It is where faith begins.
It isn't the last resort.
Right. It is the starting line of an active Christian life.
It really is the engine. And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on a specific, profound insight from this document. The author writes, "Prayer first changes the one who prays."
That's so good.
Before Hannah's situation ever changed, her spirit shifted. Before David's giant was defeated, his courage rose in the secret place of prayer.
Before the prayer moves the mountain in front of you, it has to move the heart inside of you.
Exactly. So as you go about the rest of your day, look at your own habits and consider this. When you speak into your own telephone line, are you just trying to place a quick drive-through order to change your external circumstances? Or are you willing to stay on the line long enough to let the conversation fundamentally change who you are?
That is the real deep dive.
Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you on the next one.